So, a little bit about me. I got into historical fencing, or HEMA, about a decade ago. I was awful at longsword, which is probably the most popular weapon of the time. And a very kind gentleman who was very patient said, "Why don't we try sword and buckler for you?" From there, I really latched on to 133, kind of the challenge of it. We're going to talk about what it is, and the use of the medieval sword and buckler. And for those that are not aware, the buckler is a small personal carry shield. They take many different forms and shapes through the years. The actual max size of it is highly debated because as it gets bigger, it starts to look more and more like a Viking shield. That is a topic for a different day. So a little bit about Fecht 1. So in the HEMA circles and the historical fencing circles, it's mostly referred to as 133. This is because it's a catalog number, and recently got recatalogued. So now this is considered Fecht 1. You will hear me probably interchangeably use 133 and Fecht 1 because I called it 133 for almost a decade. It was created in the early 14th century. We don't have a perfect date for it. And we know it was looted from a Franconian monastery in the 16th century. It's primarily written in Latin with German named sword techniques. So for example, most of the text and how it's talking, it's in Latin, and then they switched to using a term like fiddlebow to describe a specific technique, probably because that's what they were familiar with. Now, based on that, Dr. Forgeng, who translated, this is his translation of 133, or Fecht 1, and he speculates that the manuscript probably originates from secular clerics who were associated with the cathedral. So one of the challenges with this manuscript, and historical fencing as a whole, is understanding the context and the origins of these sources. It's not enough for us just to look at these fight manuals and deduce what they're doing because there's context involved. Different sources will change what they're doing. Now, as you can probably imagine, I'm a little off script here. I am an engineer by trade, so my paper is written very similarly to your car manual. So I figured I'd go a little off script and do the presentation today. So what we're going to be exploring today is this concept of clerics and their association to martial combat. Now, Forgeng has some very solid evidence from the manuscript itself that does hint towards a clerical origin of the techniques. There's a verse in there that says, "There are three that go forward, the rest then recede. There are three types of fighters, everyone else is going to run away." The 7 parts are used by the ordinary combatants. Now, in this context, in 133, there are what's called the 7 guards, or 7 wards, the custodia. And 133 says all fencers use these guards, whether they know about swordsmanship or not. This is what the common own. And 133 doesn't describe common in this derogative term necessarily, as much as what is easily accessible, what people can quickly understand if you hand them a sword and buckler. The sword and buckler was very popular from roughly 1200 to about 1500 and used by all sorts of people. Now the next line, the clerics hold the opposite. So in this context, we're talking about the techniques designed to beat the custodia, to beat the common fencer. And finally, Ludger holds the middle. We have no idea what that part means. We speculate that it could mean that Ludger, or Ludgerus, whoever this is, might be blending the common fight and the clerical fight, and making kind of a complete fencer out of that. Other theories go around that Ludger was the person behind the grappling sections of it. Again, different rabbit hole. Now, also in Fecht 1, we have a verse that says, "Note that he who lies above sends a blow towards the head without a shield strike, if he is an ordinary combatant. But if you wish to learn from the priest's advice, then counterbind and step." So throughout the text, there are sections where it talks about, this is what common people are doing, this is what they're normally doing, and this is what I'm advising you to do. And it's referring to, this priest it's referring to is the character in the manuscript you're seeing here. We don't actually have an author behind this manuscript. Another example we have is clerics thus flip, ordinary combatants do not, unless they are covering. So again, we're seeing this example of a distinguished difference between the clerical sources, this advanced source, because as you imagine, if most people are not learning from a Latin textbook on how to sword fight in those times, especially in 1300, But we're seeing these delineations, but this leads us to a problem. 133, we don't have a dedication like other fencing manuals have. We don't have an author. The one named character being Ludigaris, the way it's said doesn't distinguish itself as that's the fencing master or author behind it, which leads us to a challenge when it comes to interpreting these sources of what is its intent, what are its origins. And that's what we're going to get to the question today of why would members of the church in the early 14th century be creating a fencing system? They very clearly illustrate that this is a clerical source and it is different than the common people. Why were they creating this? Now, first thing we need to get out of the way. Why are we looking at the 13th century if I said this was an early 14th century manual? Because generally speaking, fencing techniques do not start with the manuscript, they start with experience beforehand. If I came to you and I said, I have this wonderful book. It collects all of these amazing techniques, and I would love for you to try them for me first. You probably would look at me skeptically. But if I came to you, like we see other manuscripts where I say, I have served in numerous campaigns, I've fought in numerous duels, where I'm not going to name who I dueled because they were 100% illegal duels. And these are the techniques I have gathered through my experience of fighting, and I've written it down for you. You might be more inclined to listen to that person as the person who is a book citizen. So because of that, 133, roughly 1300 to 1320, we're going to look at clerical sources and clerical evidence from beforehand. Now, one very common source of where we get our fight manuals that we study, particularly the German sources and the Italian sources of the Holy Roman Empire, is trial by combat. Now, trial by combat takes on multiple different faces through time. Early on, let's say roughly 1400 prior, it's a judicial duel. It's structured for very specific actions, murder, the harming of innocents, treason, heresy, and when no witness is around, you could ask for a trial by combat, but the expectation of these trials was to the death because the crime punishment would have been death in the first place. You have to appeal to a court. Later on, dueling starts to take on more of what we kind of colloquially call honor dueling, where it doesn't have to necessarily be to the death. But at least in 133's time, when we're talking about trial by combat, we have to the death. And where we have this evidence is called the Saxon Spiegel, the Saxon Mirror. It's a early 13th century German law book that was incredibly influential. We know it was mass-produced throughout hundreds of years afterwards because of its influence. Now, what we saw was regionally, we would see little tweaks, little traditions, but at least in the primary copy of this Saxon Spiegel, or the Saxon Mirror, we have judicial dueling, which describes that participants could wear any amount of linen and leather while leaving their feet and head bare in the front. And the weapons they were allowed to use included a sword and a round shield made of leather and wood. And in this illustration here, we actually see one of the copies of the Saxon Mirror depicting judicial dueling. And at first glance, we look at this and we say, hey, this kind of looks like our combatants in 133. There's something to this. Maybe 133 is tied to this judicial dueling context in here. Well, that's looking at it from the imperial law. It's looking at it from the cultural aspect to it. Now, unfortunately, because we're talking about clerics, there's also a papal side of this. And the two biggest parts of this was the Third Lateran Council in 1179, where this council was designed around reining in some of the clerics and their behavior. And one of the specific things was a cleric should not become a legal advocate in matters before a secular judge, unless they happen to be defending their own case or that of their church, or acting on behalf of the helpless who cannot conduct their own cases. Furthermore, we have the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, which generally says clerics to disassociate from shedding blood. Now, from here, we're seeing the papacy starting to say, hey guys, let's time out, let's knock this off. I'm sick of you guys participating in these duels and shedding of blood, but you can also see that there is a fair amount of legal ambiguity that it involves here, such as representing yourself in case, representing somebody who can't represent themselves in a case, or in general, I tried my best, bloodshed still occurred. Now, how effective were these Lateran councils? Mixed. Mixed is the best way to put it. In the 15th century, we have Hans Dobringer, who is written in one of the manuscripts, who is cited as being a priest who teaches multiple martial arts aspects, including longsword, wrestling, dagger. There are other mixes in that manuscript, including it's a commonplace book, so it also tells you how to, treat other things. But it also includes swordsmanship, and we have a priest being represented in here. Later examples shows Johannes Lecupner of the late 15th century, who discusses the use of the messer or the long knife. Now, in his manuscript, he's much more explicit about what his techniques are for. He has techniques that he says, if you want to show how good you are compared to your opponent, do this. And he also has more general description of self-defense. So he very clearly states that some of his technique is for sport, while some of it is also just for general self-defense. So just from looking at the Fechtbuch tradition, we see priests in later periods still participating in it, just like we saw with Fecht 1. Furthermore, judicial dueling in the 15th century Franconia, Hans Talhofer, another fencing master not part of the clergy, produced several manuscripts in the 15th century that included mason shield duels of the Franconian tradition. Now this is relevant because, as I mentioned, 133 was looted from a Franconian monastery. Another part that makes Franconia relevant is that it was run by a prince bishopric. So while we can't say if the clergy was participating in these duels, we at least know in an area run by the clergy or by a prince bishop, they were still allowing for these trials by combat. And remember, if we look at the Lateran councils, there is some ambiguity to allow for this. Another thing worth pointing out is that Legris of the infamous last duel of France in 1386 was a member of a minor clerical order. He would have been considered a cleric. He participated in a duel. Now, I've excluded it for this for the most part because of the circumstances that led to the last duel, but it is worth pointing out we have very concrete evidence, at least in France, of clerics or people associated to them participating in duels. So with trial by combat explored, let's move on to warfare and self-defense. And this is going to be a little bit clearer about where the church stood on combat. They're all for it. We have a ton of examples of the clergy being involved in warfare. Probably one of the more popular examples would be Bishop Otto of the Bayeux Tapestry. He participated in warfare. He was very open about that. And also that Fourth Lateran Council that we mentioned earlier also called for more crusades. So while it's saying we should disassociate from bloodshedding, it also says we need to take more territory. So as you can imagine, the church is very clear of warfare is on the table for the clergy. What's a little bit more nuanced is the clergy and self-defense. So prior, when we're looking more at Augustinian law, there's a little bit more of a reluctance of self-defense for the clergy. Where does that line really stand? But in the 12th century, we saw the church starting to embrace the philosophy of Christianity and its relation to self-defense and justified warfare. So in Decretum Gratiani, I apologize, many years of speech therapy to get rid of a list does make my translation of Latin pretty barbaric. Made the case that the right of self-defense was grounded in natural law, while the right to wage war was grounded in law of nations. We're starting to see this connection of, just by the fact that we're part of this earth, the natural order of things, we do have a right to self-defense. And by the 13th century, the early 13th century, Pope Gregory IX emphasized the importance of the Decretum Gratiani, which again highlights the fact that at least 100 years prior to 133, self-defense and the church's embracement of it as a natural order is more popular. Now, let's get into the prince bishops of the Holy Roman Empire. They served as landowners, the lords of these regions, and they are tasked with protecting their area just like everybody else. By the 12th century, prince bishops were expected to answer the call of arms by the emperor, so we have a military obligation of at least the highest ranking clergy in these areas. And unfortunately, the instability of the 13th century riddled the empire with conflict. Internal, otherwise, we have off and on emperors during this time. It was a very turbulent point for it. Some examples we have is in 1213, a battle between the forces of Henry, Duke of Brabant, and Hugh Pierrepoint, who is the Bishop of Liege, took place over a land dispute. There was a dead son who takes the land. Well, let's fight over it and have that. So we know that we have a bishop in conflict here. In 1257, we also have Lord Gregorio, the Patriarch of the Holy See of Aquileia, was sponsored by Pope Alexander III to siege Padua and liberate the city from Enzalino III da Romana. What's significant about this is we have a German lord taking an Italian city of the Holy Roman Empire. Enzalino, now based on the accounts, was considered a tyrant, at least in their own context. He sieged the city for almost a full decade. At that point, the Pope's like, I'm sick of this. Patriarch, one of the heads of the church, I'm going to fund you, go liberate this city. So when we start looking at prince bishops and their role in the Holy Roman Empire, we're even seeing the Pope calling them to arms. So we have imperial obligations, we have papal obligations, both centering towards warfare for the clergy at this time. Now, we can't really talk about this period without also talking about the religious military orders. As we mentioned, the Fourth Lateran Council did have a call to arms for the Crusades, and we see the rise of these religious military orders. And one of the more significant ones of the Holy Roman Empire is the Teutonic Order. So we have a German religious military order, largely German, that in 1198 was formally recognized by the papacy. And what this allows is for non-clerical individuals in the 13th century to have a unique path to earning the title of cleric. So, as mentioned, Legree, he held a clerical position in minor orders. That gave him that title. Of course, he was granted that because of his connections and being of knighthood. But also, laymen who could be accepted into the order, and there was a whole hierarchy and tier there, would also have been considered clerics. So again, we are seeing combatants and clerics even as accessible to lay people through religious military orders. The Teutonic Order participated largely in the Baltic Crusades of the 13th century, and in this map here you can see how widespread they were at this period. So what can we learn from this? There are lots of examples, and these are not cherry-picked examples. This was a giant pile of examples of clerics being involved with warfare that I summarized down to a few ones. So let's talk about what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to conclude that Fecht 1 originates from military orders like the Teutonic Knights. I am not the History Channel. I cannot just make connections to religious military orders based on this. I also cannot conclude that Fecht 1 originates from a prince bishop or prince bishopric. While it is looted from a monastery, Franconian monastery in the 16th century, there's no definitive evidence to link it to the prince bishoprics of Franconia. It's just one of those challenges where it could have moved around. There's nothing very distinct culturally that could link it to a specific area. What I will say is that Fecht 1 is a byproduct of the relationship between the clergy and conflict in the 13th century. The high-ranking clergy had an invested interest in combat. A prince bishopric and a bishop who would be a head of their region, including the cathedral. There's an investment in it. If you are if you have aspirations to become a prince bishop, you also have aspirations to protect land, which has a military aspect to that. Based on that, I believe Dr. Forgeng's hypothesis that the manuscript originates from a secular cleric associated with cathedral seems plausible. It's very written in an instructional manual. It's very designed to be taught. It's almost scientific in nature, where it talks about if the opponent does this, then you do this. And there are options you have. There's a very scientific approach to this. However, we don't have a cathedral we can really associate it to, so just by the nature of it being instructional and the fact that it's produced in hands that likely were scribes, talking in Latin, it's plausible. However, we can't say for certain. However, we can say that 133 is associated to this long period of clergy and conflict.